Peter's been humiliated. Now he will be humbled. For today's quick reminder, I would like to pick up where we left off last week, which would have been John chapter 21, verse 14. We've seen that Jesus has provided the meal, and then he asks the disciples to eat with him. So we see the fellowship, the desire that Christ has for his disciples to be with him in what he's doing. Now, after they've eaten the meal, Jesus turns his attention specifically to Peter. So picking up in verse 15 of chapter 21 in John, we read this. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my lambs." He said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished, but when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go." Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned around and he saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his bosom and at supper and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, and what about this man?" And Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." I believe what we see here in verses 15 to 17 is Jesus addressing Peter having denied him 3 times back in chapter 18 of John, where Jesus has been arrested and he's being tried, and Peter is asked 3 times if he's one of Jesus' disciples. And 3 times Peter says no. And now it would appear that Jesus is addressing this situation with Peter, but with the question, "Do you love me?" Now, a lot has been made of the word love in this passage, how Jesus uses agape and Peter will use phileo. And to tell you the truth, after looking at this and digging in quite a bit with it, I think maybe we're making too much out of that. Because the 2 words in the Gospel of John are really kind of used interchangeably. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll just read a little bit from Warren Wiersbe's comments on this. He says that it's doubtful that we should make too much of an issue over this because the 2 words are often used interchangeably in the Gospel of John. In John 3:16, God's love for man is agape, but in John 16:27, it's phileo. The Father's love for his Son is agape love in John 3:15, but phileo in John 5:20. And then Christians are supposed to love one another. And according to John 3:34, this love is agape love, but in John 15:19, it's phileo love. So it would appear, Warren Wiersbe goes on to say, that John used these 2 words synonymous, or as synonymous. Whatever fine distinctions they might have, there may have been between them. So it would appear that it would be more profitable for us to look at this conversation between Jesus and Peter in the context or in the light of what has already happened in this chapter, where we have already found from previous quick reminders that Jesus is the source and his people are to be the responders in this relationship. If one loves Jesus, then he will come in line with this truth, that Jesus is the source. I am the responder. Love for Jesus insists or requires that others be first. In 1 Corinthians 3, 4-7, we read, love is patient, love is kind, it's not jealous, love does not brag and is not arrogant, it does not act unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, it is not provoked, it does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, and endures all things. So others are first. Love for Jesus will show itself as being preeminent in our life. Again, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, chapter 13, verse 13 says this, but now faith, hope, love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. It will be preeminent. The love for Jesus requires others first. It requires preeminence in our life. And love for Jesus requires sacrifice of self. In John 3:16, Jesus says that God so loved the world that he gave. And then we see that the same should be true of us in John 15, verse 13. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus is telling us that this should be true of us. So love for Jesus will require others first, preeminence in our life, sacrifice of self, and then we find in John 14:15 that it requires obedience. If you love me, Jesus says, you will keep my commandments. So all of this is summed up, I think, when Jesus tells Peter, tend or shepherd my sheep. Where Peter had acted with selfishness in his 3 denials, Jesus now emphasizes 3 times that if Peter loves him, then he will be about others and not himself. In John 15, verses 8-13, we read, my Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. Just as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be made full. This is my commandment, that you love one another, just as I loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. Tend my sheep. Shepherd my sheep. Love my sheep. Lay down your life for them. So this is true of Christ, so it should be true of us, and in that we display our love. Charlie was just in here with me before I recorded, and we were talking about this, and he made this statement. Peter's been humiliated. Now he will be humbled, and it will be the work of Christ. If you love Jesus, it will show in how you care for others. And this will not be of your own strength. Jesus says twice in this passage, follow me. Following requires, by definition, being in the same way. The word follow actually means that in the Greek, be in the same way. And we see this encouraged by the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5, where he says, have this attitude in yourselves, which is also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. So this is true of Christ. Being humble, And it's the work that he does in us as we walk in relationship with him, as we follow him. So, follow me, Jesus says. Following him means to be as me, be the same as me, and that can only be as if he is the source. Following him requires nothing to do with what would keep us from him. In Luke chapter 18, verse 22, when Jesus heard this, he said to him, "One thing you still lack, sell all that you possess and distribute it to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me." What's the one thing that keeps you from being with him? So following him requires denial of self. It requires having nothing to do with what keeps us from him. And it requires faith in him and not in you for him. Mark chapter 10, verse 52 says this, "And Jesus said to him, 'Go, your faith has made you well.' Immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the road. His faith made him well, and as a result of his faith, he followed him." So following Jesus means to be in the same way. It requires having nothing to do with what keeps us from him, and it requires faith. Before he was a missionary in China, Hudson Taylor was, by choice, living in a low-income section of England. It was there that the Lord taught him what it meant to follow Jesus, to be in the same way as Jesus. He worked for an absent-minded physician who often forgot to pay Hudson his wages. This was the case at the end of one week when Hudson found himself in financial need. Because of his conviction of God's providential care to bring this matter up with his employer, Hudson believed would be an act of unbelief in God and his care for his sheep. So Hudson found himself having to live on what would be the equivalent of about $10 to $12 in today's money. That evening, he found himself in the company of a family that was starving. All he had was the $10 to $12. If he gave it to them, then how would he survive? Hudson struggled over this. If he gave them all that he had, how would he eat? How would he just take care of the very basic essentials that he needed? After all, he was hungry too. The family asked him to pray for them, to which he agreed to do. And it was while praying that he knew. The Lord just worked in his heart. He knew that the Lord would have him give this family the whole $10. To the family's shock and amazement, this is exactly what Hudson did, which greatly ministered to the family as they were overwhelmed with God's care for them. The next day, a package was delivered to Hudson's door. And in the package was a pair of gloves, and inside one of the gloves he found money to the amount of 4 times what he had given away the night before. You see that all Jesus asks of you is that you be with him, that you follow him. From and within that relationship, he wants you to be about what he is doing, trusting him for all that is necessary in that moment. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said this, "May God in his mercy lead us through these times, but above all, may he lead us to himself." My name is Kelly Daugherty. I'm the host of the His Hill podcast. This has been a quick reminder of the podcast ministry. If you would like to get in touch with me, please do so. You can do that by using email, and my address is Kelly, Kelly, @hishill.org. Thanks for listening, and remember, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus.